kindred friends, and welcome to the Radical Emergence podcast, where we're having conversations at the edge of transformation. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Jen Pierre-Rich, and with me is my friend, co-host, and co-collaborator, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones. Please check out our bios in the show notes where you'll find links to our work, websites, and can find ways to connect with us. If you're not already following, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and join our mailing list so you can stay up to date on new episodes as they drop.
Hello, everybody. Sally here. This exciting project consists of about 26 episodes in all, dedicated to better defining and understanding transformation on all its levels of reality. That's personal, social, as well as ecological. We're going to ask, what is transformation? Why bother? Why do we need it? And what does it feel like or look like? We'll also ask, can we induce it or perhaps accidentally block it? These are really important questions for growth.
We draw not only on our hard-won life experience, we are also transdisciplinarians. So what the heck is that? Well, it means we want to understand transformation from as many lenses as possible, including formal academic disciplines and discourses, art, media, and popular culture. Importantly, we draw from our living experience.
So we are experts, so to speak, but mostly in just one small but highly critical area, our own suffering, and the medicines that we've both used to transform our own lives. So to this end, we've also added decades of committed practices, as well as formal degrees, including specific in-depth studies in the mechanisms of transformation, because we needed to understand this healing journey for ourselves.
Does this entitle us to help others? You bet. Absolutely. Because it is by sharing our stories, knowledge, and direct experience that we offer sane, sober, practical tools for living on the ground of life. So welcome. Strap in, hang on, and enjoy the ride as we deep dive into a universe of transformation.
Welcome back to our episode 13 on our podcast, Radical Emergence, Conversations at the Edge of Transformation. So today is quite a special episode for Jen and I, because we came to the studies of transformation because we had both experienced a lot of trauma in our lives, and both of us needed to figure out how to heal that shit. So as Jen and I do, we go into things intensively and we go down that deep rabbit hole and we learn as much as we can. And she and I both really are blessed with a level of self-discipline. So when we learn something, we really apply it. And she and I both noticed that when you do the work, it works. So we're going to talk about trauma today, because it is one of the blockages to transformation. And we're both really here to help alleviate people's suffering. Now that sounds grandiose. And the only reason we're doing this is because we've turned our own deep wounds into our magic. This is what we do. And next week, we're going to look at that, how we turn the trauma and the wound into the gift and the healing. So today, though, we're going to really focus on a couple of definitions, and we're going to look at how This applies to childhood specifically. Then in the middle, we're going to look at how adults carry that trauma into their life and how that plays out. It's a lifelong journey healing some traumas. And in the third section, we'll look at how to heal it. And that's just a brief intro. There are so many fabulous speakers out there today that can resource you if you're interested in healing trauma. So I will personally own that most of my ideas come from people like Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, Bessel van der Kolk. Jen and I have done a lot of research in this field because we experienced it, we needed to know about it, we went to the experts. But then there's areas that we have pioneered on our own too. We've taken that knowledge further. For example, I go deeply into how creativity heals our trauma. But that's a different topic. We've looked at that. You can go back in our earlier episodes and find 3 episodes dedicated to creativity and how it transforms us. So, big topic. And just to be vulnerable for a moment, it's always good to understand that Jen and I may appear to be experts, but we still struggle with our traumas daily. I still suffer from the long-term effects of some very real traumas in my life, one of which is an autoimmune problem in my nervous system. So trauma, one of the definitions is an injury to the nervous system. So let's unpack that a little bit. How can you have an injury to the nervous system? Well, it's when you experience trauma, and it can be chronic over time if you're exposed to that in your family of origin, and we'll look at that, or it can be a sudden dramatic incident or accident or violation of your boundaries. So both of those, chronic long-term exposure or sudden dramatic incidents, can deeply affect our nervous system. If it's the chronic exposure, that can actually affect our brain development as well. If it's young, if you are exposed to that as a child, it actually can damage the development of the brain as well as the nervous system. If it happens as an adult, you've probably done a major part of your brain development, but it can still damage memory. It can still damage how we experience time. And what really happens is the limbic system, which is really the emotions, and it's the very primordial part of the nervous system, the early brain, can be split off from the prefrontal cortex. In other words, our thinking. So the emotions and the thinking can become very discombobulated. We're going to unpack that. And this prevents us over time from reaching our full potential. So that's why Jen and I are interested in this, is trauma is a blockage to transformation and our full potential. And unless we take a look at that, we may have some very distorted parts of our nervous system and our feeling and thinking, and our relationships will be very affected. So there's a lot of self-development teachers out there who won't even look at this stuff. They just say, bypass that. We're not interested in your past or your story. We're just going straight for the present moment. We're going to open to the present moment, and we're just going to be here now and be enlightened. That's all very well. And some people can do that. Most people cannot. The injury to the nervous system will prevent you from being in the present moment. And that's what we're going to look at. So it doesn't matter how hard you try to become in the present moment, as some enlightenment teachers will teach you, and that is true, but there will be blockages. So that's why we look at trauma as part of the course on transformation here. It's very important. And there are a lot of gurus out there who have not done that work and who become very distorted. Their teachings are brilliant. They themselves continue to act out with a lot of shadow that they refuse to look at. So that's dangerous, actually. So the prefrontal cortex can continue to be brilliant. Lots of brilliant teachers out there, while the limbic system and the nervous system has an injury and they're acting out of shadow. So let's take a look at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning and understand what we call adverse childhood experiences. So it's another word that you can look up and Google and take your time with this. It's an acronym called ACEs, ACES, adverse childhood experiences. So when a little forming body and brain is exposed to parental levels of stress, that little body co-regulates with its parents. We're designed like that. Our nervous systems resonate with those in our field. So if the parents are undergoing a lot of stress, that little nervous system will also be very stressed. And what happens is the adrenaline system and the cortisol will be elevated because that's our stress response, and it gets stuck there because the constant chronic stress puts us in a pattern of fight and flight very young. And when that happens, when there's a dysregulation in the nervous system like that, the cortisol and adrenaline actually repress serotonin and dopamine. So bringing that little nervous system back into harmony so that the child can feel pleasure and joy and relaxation and be able to play joyfully as every child should. It's hard when that nervous system is ramped up and it can get stuck there. And that's the injury to the nervous system, is we get stuck in fight and flight. Those patterns then become triggers for the rest of your life. We're not in the present moment. We continue to respond from an elevated fight and flight in our nervous system. So it's long-term effects. And we know that if the brain and the nervous system are impacted very young, the outcomes for those children are not optimal. It impacts their brain development, it impacts their social relationships, it impacts their ability to learn and to be educated, which impacts their possibility of a career trajectory. The risk behaviors are elevated, they turn to addiction, risky behavior, self-harm, in order to deal with the dissociation and the depression and the numbness. So the pain that is caused by being constantly stuck in an elevated nervous system causes risky behaviors that in the long term are really damaging for the outcomes of that child. And for women, it's mostly women. Most of us respond then with autoimmune diseases at some point down the road. At 50 or 60, the chances of all sorts of diseases like diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia are totally elevated. So something like 80% of adult women who've had 4 or 5 ACEs will end up with long-term chronic disease. So that's why we look at this. It's not optimal to bypass what happened to us in childhood. Although many of us, it's hard for us to take a look at what happened. I would really recommend anybody who's feeling triggered right now in our audience to just take a breath. This is hard. It's not pleasant to discuss. Jen and I both said this is going to be a hard one. But bringing self-awareness is the beginning. So these are briefly the 10 ACEs. Most adults will have 3 or 4. Those who go on to have poor outcomes and even chronic disease can have 5 or 6. And some really, really challenging childhoods could have all of them. So these are briefly, and you can Google and spend time with us. There's tons of books out there. There's physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and then there's the neglects, the physical and emotional neglect. So what didn't happen, not just what did happen, what didn't happen, because you were pretty much in maybe a benign neglect situation where you were just told to go to your room and amuse yourself. There was no alignment with your parents, no attunement, none of your needs were met. And then, of course, there's the mental illness. Did any of the parents have mental illness? Was there a divorce? That's like 50% of us right there. Was there substance abuse in the family? Was there violence against the mother? And possibly a parental incarceration. Somebody went to prison. So those are the 10. I'm sure some people are beginning to wonder, oh my goodness, that sounds familiar. So just take a moment to breathe. Just becoming aware of the fact that these are now diagnosable, that they're real, that they can have long-term damage. That's a hard thing to just hear right there. So if you've reached adulthood and you have chronic depression that you don't understand, if you have some numbness, if you feel dissociated sometimes, if you're easily triggered, if you're reactive instead of responsive, if you don't feel connected to people or yourself, if you feel isolated but don't know why you can't connect, if you've got a lot of problems with intimacy, or if you don't feel seen or heard, or you can't express yourself because you were shut down, your needs were shut down, your voice was shut down, sometimes physically shut down. These could be indicators that we need to find our story and take a little bit of a look at it. So we're not going to look at that right now. We've got lots of episodes coming up where we will slowly unpack this and gently carry you along. It's a lot of information. So we're starting now just with looking at childhood, and I'm going to pass it over to Jen now. And Jen too has a lot of personal experience with this. This is not just something we read about in books. We've had to grapple with our own experiences and really have the courage to look at what happened to us and then have the self-discipline to work with it and heal it. So over to you, Jen. I know you've got some amazing stories.
Well, I love describing trauma as an insult and injury to the nervous system. I think that is such an important framing for how we are currently, presently, right now, understanding what trauma is, and not only what trauma is, but how we need to heal it through our nervous system. So I'm really glad that you brought that forward, Sally. I'm really glad to be here with you all again. This is our passion project. And, you know, this episode talking about trauma is important because trauma impedes that transformation. And because trauma impedes that transformation, this is a critical lens we want to take as we explore various facets of transformation. On the last episode, we talked about what prohibits and what gets in the way of transformation. And here we're going to go a little bit deeper into one way that transformation is really impeded. And since I've had to work through my own complex trauma and find various tools to use, this show is really near and dear to our hearts, as Sally mentioned, and to our daily life, because we deal with it. We have not only dealt with childhood trauma, but we both deal with chronic trauma coming through various things that we experience in our life. So childhood trauma, as Sally has laid out so perfectly for us, it disrupts us on all levels: personal, social, ecological. As Sally said, it even alters our brain development, our neurochemistry. And for a lot of us, I felt like when Sally was talking, she was saying my story, right? I'm sure many of you were listening and going, well, that's me, that's my story. And I heard myself in what you were saying, Sally. So trauma impacts us in all kinds of profound ways. But the good news, I believe, the good news is that we can also reverse a lot of that damage, right? And we can heal ourselves, and how we heal ourselves is from the inside out. And in this episode, we're kind of taking a developmental view of our of trauma, because it's important to kind of see where you are in your development and how that relates to how you're healing trauma. Because then, if you can identify where you're at on a developmental trajectory through your healing, you can identify the strategies and supports that you need better to meet whatever developmental point you're at in your healing. So that, I believe, and most of the preliminary thinkers and writers and researchers on trauma believe that the root of the wounding caused by trauma is the loss of safety. The loss of safety with our caretakers becomes loss of safety within ourselves and loss of safety in the world. And when you feel unsafe in the world, like many of us do, that makes it really hard to move with the momentum of transformation, right? Because how do we trust our own journey when we don't feel safe, right? And because we're too busy second guessing ourselves or sabotaging ourselves, like I did, and so many of us do. So many of us experience negative behaviors later in life because of the childhood trauma that we experience in childhood. And we're going to talk about some of those ways to deal with that childhood trauma and adult trauma later in the show. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but I just want to say that if the wound is that we don't feel safe in the world, then the healing is about regaining safety inside. And I've spent a lot of my healing energy becoming a safe place within myself, coming home within myself inside. And that's a full circle healing moment that happens when we have that inner homecoming where that safety is reestablished within ourselves that was stripped from us when we were children or when we were adults, when we had a traumatic experience, right? So when we reestablish that safety within ourselves, wow, that's a beautiful thing, right? And because there's a fractal relationship between our inner world and our outer world, that inner healing that we do then becomes healing that we give the world, right? Because then how we operate in the world, it changes, right? So, and Sally mentioned some of the main thinkers in the world of trauma-informed life, and Bessel van der Kolk was mentioned, and he's a psychiatrist and researcher, and he says that exactly what Sally said, that trauma wires our brains for fear. right? Sally mentioned fight or flight, right? So we're literally hardwired to fear. So I want to just give this quote from him. He says, it's about becoming safe to feel what you feel. When you're traumatized, you're afraid of what you're feeling because what you're feeling is always terror or fear or helplessness. I think these body-based techniques to help you feel what's happening in your body and breathe into it and not run away from it allows you to befriend your experience. And so that's what we're talking about here, that something fundamental, a safety, has been stripped from us. And what we owe to ourselves more than anything is to return that safety to ourselves and bring that safety that we deserve back home, inside where it belongs. And that healing move allows us to move with transformation in a positive, generative way. So we can heal from that childhood trauma, but it's a deep inside job that also requires community. And I'm going to talk about that later, but I'm going to stop right there because I think we're going to go deeper into adult trauma and how that looks in our adult life, how we're traumatized in our adult life. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Sally, and I'm super excited to go deeper into this show. Yeah, it's great.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, one of my favorite of all time researchers in trauma is Gabor Mate. So look up his books, fantastic books, one of which is When the Body Says No. But there's fabulous books out there. So if this is piquing your interest, there's lots of resources and we will put them into the show notes for you to take a look. The best books out there. Happy to do that so you can read further. But Gabor Mate, who is a physician, a medical doctor who's specialized in the treatment of trauma and then also addictions, which can be a result of trauma, says that trauma is disconnection. There's one thing you remember, it's disconnection. So what is that? It's the limbic disconnecting from the prefrontal cortex is a disconnection. So that we're either completely triggered all the time or we're numbed over and just conceptualizing our life and we've repressed the limbic system. And we become rigid and conceptual and we stop feeling, go numb. So those are two ways we can respond. There's a disconnection. So we're disconnected from ourselves and our needs, and we're disconnected from others because we don't have any safety. So part of that healing is reconnection of the nervous system, bringing that into balance, reconnecting with the parts of ourselves we repressed, which was actually a way that our body protected us from the incident. Suddenly there's a dissociation from the moment. And that is a way to help us not be overwhelmed by the event, but we can get frozen there. 20 years later, we're still dissociated. And it's no longer relevant, but we're still living in the past. So we need to bring the parts of ourselves back together. And then we need to find safety with people again. So there's a lot of ways we have to reconnect. And Dr. Mate talks a lot about the medical community and how traumatized they are. They're the ones that take care of our trauma, and yet they're operating as traumatized beings. So he goes into a lot about how he is typical of that the pressure to do well at med school means that you just live in your prefrontal cortex. You have to repress your emotions. You eventually stop actually even feeling anything. Eventually, to survive this high pressure learning system, to go through med school where the authority figures crap on you all the time and you have to stop feeling anything, you just have to perform. And eventually the work addiction gets rewarded financially. The community praises you for working so hard that you stop feeling your family's falling apart. Long story short, those are the beautiful, wonderful folks who are taking care of us when we're traumatized. They have no training at all around emotional trauma. They deal with the physical trauma. That's the extent of their training. So there's a physical wound, and they're really well trained in that. The emotional wound, they don't really have time for in the 10 minutes. You have to then split off and go find help yourself for that part. So I want to just bring that into a real story for you. And I'd just like to warn folks, if you're feeling a little bit triggered right now, the story I'm going to share with you might be a bit much for you to hear. So it's up to you. I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me when I had a C-section. And part of the trauma is not what actually happened to you. It's what happened inside you as a result of that event. That's the emotional trauma. So there's the physical trauma of what happened to me, and then there's the emotional trauma that I'm left to deal with for the rest of my life, unsupported. And I'll explain that story. So we do know now that if you have a traumatic event and you're immediately supported and held, the likelihood is that that will be healed very quickly. If you're left alone to deal with something and have no support, and you're isolated and sometimes shamed, that trauma can be there forever. So it's how we deal with an event if we're supported and held, and we can regulate, co-regulate with our nurses and doctors, or our partners, or our families, or our friends. If we're supported through that, the healing can be quite quick, even from a terrible incident. So I'm going to explain how complex trauma can be. When I had my second child, I was living in a tiny little community, and I was part of the medical community through marriage. So the medical community were my close friends, which was problematic in a little town if you need surgery. So I came to give birth, and I happened to have a 10.5-pound baby inside me that I couldn't get out. This little monster. And 36 hours later, it's still not going to come out, and the baby's starting to get distressed. And so we need an emergency C-section, which is great. Medical science is fantastic. I'd be dead now if it wasn't for medical science. But I want to explain, there was an incident that has traumatized me for the rest of my life, and I'm still dealing with that, is the epidural failed. And so when they cut me to pull out this 10.5-pound baby, I could feel everything. However, I was medicated enough with the pre-meds that I couldn't talk and I couldn't move, so I couldn't explain that to the medical people. So they didn't know. So I was able to feel everything as they cut me open, a long gash in my belly, and pulled this 10.5-pound baby up, until one of my beautiful, dearest GP friends looked over the shield and looked at my face and said, "Oh, there's something really wrong here." And then they gave me a lot of local anesthetics and continued with the procedure. However, so the trauma for me was about 10 minutes of pain that I can't even describe. There are literally no words for that pain. Having my autonomic nervous system alive, but the rest of me frozen, unable to speak, having no bodily autonomy at all, having my literal body's boundary violated and wounded, and not being able to share that with anybody. So in my nervous system, there is forever a near-death experience where my soul almost left my body. I can't describe that in words to people. I was almost looking down at my own body. It almost left. It was so unbearable. So how does that get dealt with? Normally, you're supported through that. That incident is recognized. You then get 6 months of treatment. How do you unpack an experience like that? How do you get support with your child? You go home to a little toddler. You've had this out-of-body near-death experience, blah, blah, blah. Well, in a small little medical community, that doesn't happen. That incident gets denied. Didn't happen. There was no medical malpractice. This happens to everybody. This is a normal C-section. In fact, you need to just get out of bed in a day and a half and go home to your little toddler with your newborn and just deal with this on your own. So the trauma was not the C-section. That was fantastic. I would be dead. The trauma was the lack of support afterwards, the denial of the experience in order to safeguard people's reputations in a small town, the denial that it ever happened. So you can't go and see someone for support, like a psychiatrist, because that person's also your friend. And the medical community are going to gaslight you because this never happened. Reputations are at stake. This was a normal C-section. Don't make a fuss. In fact, would you please stay silent? This is embarrassing for all of us. So I could not talk about this incident to anybody. I had to literally stay silent because people's reputations were more important than my medical incident. Friendships were more important. Loyalty came before an actual physical and emotional, and I would say a trauma to my soul. That incident energetically touched my soul. 35 years ago, all good. Still have those friendships, well beyond it. To this day, nobody acknowledges that ever happened. So I was gaslit terribly. Anyway, so I had to deal with this on my own. That is a real trauma at every scale of my body, physical, emotional, to my friendships, I would say to my actual soul. That lives with me forever, but the wound turned into the miracle in that I found my story. I'm now able to speak about it. I won't stay silent about it. Other women go through horrific experiences like this and need to know that they need to be able to speak about it and not be silenced. And their body is as important as people's reputations and friendships. So I found art, and that's another, we're going to talk next episode about how we turn the wound into the help or the gift. And that was through creativity for me. And that's how I dealt with this trauma, which is mostly fixed. But every now and again, I'm triggered when somebody tells me to keep silent about something that's important to me, that my body is not as important as somebody else's career, or my health should be put on the back burner so that we can pretend there's peace and everything is normal. So I still get triggered. That's the trauma. It's not the C-section or how it was managed. It's in my nervous system when my autonomy and my voice feel like they're being taken away from me. I literally go back to the surgical table. So I have to deal with that image. There's lots of ways I do that. And we're going to talk about how to heal stuff in the third section. But I would like to hand it back to Jen now to talk about adult trauma and how that lingers in our nervous system.
You're just, when I've heard that story before, and I'm just, my body, I can just feel, inside what the horror that you must have felt. And I can imagine how that lives in you and how you would get triggered. I mean, it makes perfect sense. It lives in the body. And you're right. Later, we're going to talk about, why somatic healing is important, and because we have to address it in the body where those wounds live. Wow, Sally, I just have so much love and respect for you, and I'm so sorry that happened. I'm really sorry that happened. It was a massive injustice to you. Yeah. Okay. Yes, so adult trauma. Well, Sally so beautifully outlined how it looks. Medical trauma is something that so many of us, I experience. I have complex PTSD uh, from medical trauma. And, with the last few years, we've had a pandemic, we've had, political upheaval, we've taken a lot of traumatizing blows as adults. And then when you add to those blows our childhood trauma, on top of that, we have what's called complex trauma. That just means there's more than one source of trauma. And I honestly know very few people in the world that don't have some sort of trauma, if not complex trauma, because we suffer from all kinds of abuses just being ordinary people in the world. There's social obligations, financial obligations, our work commitments and family needs. All of these things that we're expected to do can become traumatic and toxic when they're mandatory. Sally started talking about medical doctors and how they become completely disassociated from their patients because they're expected to perform at a particular level, and with a kind of detachment, right, that becomes conditioned. And we don't live in a world that necessarily is very forgiving, and it doesn't encourage us to slow down. We're just expected to keep up the pace, right? And that expectation to constantly be productive is in and of itself a form of trauma that many of us experience. And as Sally said, a lot of us have chronic illnesses and chronic pain. I live with that. And we don't talk enough, I think, about how constantly being bombarded with physical pain is a source of trauma. Um, I often feel like my own body is against me. And those of us like Sally and I who have autoimmune diseases, our body is literally against us, right? And so I want to say here that this is why it's so important to be intentional about befriending our bodies and not having an antagonistic relationship with our bodies, even when they're painful. And that's a hard thing, to have a loving relationship with something that's causing you pain. But if I let that antagonistic relationship happen with my body, and I feel like my body is always traumatizing, is my main source of pain, then I'm going to become a victim of my body, right? And that's going to set me up for a lot of misery in the future. So and we deal with, we can have one traumatic experience, but with chronic pain and chronic illness, it's constant. And so it is literally changing our brain chemistry because we're constantly being bombarded with stress hormones and stress chemicals. So again, we really have to be intentional here about bringing that inner friendship and gentleness to ourselves on the inside, because that's how we combat all of that negative impact that the stress hormones are how the stress hormones are impacting us. That is the being gentle inside, being self-aware inside, being friends inside with ourselves. That is the medicine to heal what is traumatizing us, right? So we need functional tools in our toolbox so that we can be in a healthy, functional relationship with whatever we're experiencing, whether that's our trauma from childhood or something that's in adulthood that's ongoing, some unceasing traumatic experiencing that we're living through, whatever trauma we're experiencing, we need really good tools. We need the tools to live on life's terms, which is often unpredictable and complex and chaotic, right? So we're going to talk about those tools. I'm going to pass it back to Sally, and we're just going to briefly, as we close it up today, just talk about some of the tools that we can use to engage with our trauma and heal it on this journey. Because I wrote down in my notes as you were talking, Sally, I really liked it. When we do the work, it works. Yeah, back to you, Sally.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So, yeah, beautiful. You yourself have also experienced medical trauma, as so many of our listeners will have in one way or another, even if there was no accidental mistake, if there was no malpractice. Constant pain is constant trauma, chronic. So there's medical trauma. There's also gendered trauma from just being a woman or a man. We have our own traumas. We have racial trauma just from being a different colored skin, from being white. We have economic trauma. And when these things come together, somebody can be holding a lot of intersecting trauma in their body and not even be aware of it. So we will unfold how to work with this in episodes to come. Some of the ways that we need to focus on healing is establishing security and safety again. That's number one. So that we can learn how to regulate our nervous system again. Really, the chronic dysregulation, we need to learn how to work with that. And I think the best way to learn how to do that is through breathing and meditation and yoga practices. That is learning how to deeply calm the central nervous system again. So embodied somatic practices as well as therapeutic practices, learning how to find the voice, find the story, share that with a sympathetic listener who's really listening, who's really present. Because when trauma happens, people are really absent from you and you become absent from yourself. So the really present listener goes a long way to helping you regulate and share your story, expressing the story. So we call that narrative medicine. It's a way we can heal ourselves. Or visual images, they really work too, because a lot of our trauma is pre-verbal. There are incidents where there are literally no words. So drawing the incident or writing about it can be super helpful. Things like learning how to find our happy chemicals, the dopamine, the oxytocin, the endorphins, and the serotonin. There's different ways. You can Google that. Happy chemicals, neurotransmitters, how do we boost those? Super important to find our pleasure again, because the adrenal system is out of whack. Cortisol, adrenaline triggering. We need to learn how to find our pleasure. So Google the 4 neurotransmitters and the chemicals that make us happy and how to do that. Exercise, relating with people, creating stuff, all that kind of thing. The happy habits, regularity, calming the nervous system, regular food, regular sleep, regular exercise, circadian rhythm, getting that into regularity with the sun and the moon, so that our bodies feel soothed and held. So we can really only meet our potential once our body is in harmony again. It starts from the body up. So Gabor Mate would say these are the 7 A's, he calls them, when you've had a traumatic incident. Acceptance, awareness, anger, finding your autonomy again, finding healthy attachments, asserting your story, and affirming your value. So the 7 A's, you can find that in his book, When the Body Says No. Super helpful. They're actual steps for gently approaching and healing our traumas. This is not something you need to live with for the rest of your life. Establishing trust with beloveds. We start to co-regulate. People who are regulated, just being around us can help us regulate. We're in a field of resonance. So over the next couple of episodes, Jen and I will unfold this more. And I just wanted to say thank you if you're still here with us. Your little nervous systems are probably activated. Trauma stories are never easy to share or to hear, but we can grow the capacity for being present with each other's pain. Really important skill. So I'm going to hand it back to Jen, and thank you for sticking with us on one of probably the hardest episode Jen and I will share with our listeners. Back to you, Jen.
Oh, yeah. So painful to hear each other's stories, but you're right. It's by hearing and witnessing each other's stories that we really heal on a whole other level. And your story, I know, is a gift to me and everyone listening, Sally. So I want to thank you for that and for everything that you have shared with us today. You're a font of wisdom and knowledge, and I'm so grateful for you. I want to reemphasize exactly what Sally said, the importance of skills, tools in our toolbox that help us in our development and healing. Mindfulness, meditation, breathing, just learning to breathe is an essential skill for those of us who deal with trauma. Music, grounding and relaxation exercises. There's so many tools that we can use that help us manage our stress and our triggers. Without those tools in our toolbox, we don't have the tools we need to help ourselves. And we can't be that conscious person inside who can, hack those happiness chemicals. We can't bring our bodies and minds what they need. We can't bring ourselves the medicine we need. And as Sally said, relationships are so much of where our healing happens. In my own relationship, my wife has helped me so much in healing my trauma. She's the reason I healed so much of my trauma, because she saw the best in me before I saw the best in myself, right? So we heal in relationships, not in isolation. As Sally mentioned, and I harp on every single episode, self-awareness is key. But that self-awareness has to be mixed with the relational wisdom that allows for the support we need so that healing can happen in our personal lives, in our relationships, and in our communities. We need support systems. We need our companion animals. We need support groups and our supportive, beloved friends, what I call my soul pod, to receive understanding and to be witnessed, as we've done today with Sally, listening to her story. So we have to learn to love and care for ourselves from the inside out. We have to be intentional about it. If we've felt unsafe in the world because of trauma, either as children or as adults, then we've got to give ourselves the love and attention and care that we need from the inside out. We have to build that field of safety within ourselves, so that we can feel safe when we move with the movement of transformation, right? If we don't feel safe inside, we're not going to move with it as easily and flexibly as we do when we feel safe within ourselves. And so, yes, once again, healing in the body, somatic healing, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps a Score. It certainly does. We've got to return to our bodies, as Sally said, so that we can heal our wounds where they live within our bodies. And I have to say, finally, as I wrap up here, that one of the most important ways that I work with trauma, and that Sally works with trauma, and that many of us are working with trauma, is to be gentle and kind and loving and compassionate and patient with ourselves from the inside out. We have to be gentle with ourselves, especially with our shadows. We have to be gentle inside, because our wounds aren't going to come to the surface and come to the light if we're being harsh, right? They arise up through that field of safety that we build within ourselves. So if we're going to heal our deepest wounds, we have to feel safe within first, right? So we're creating what's called a trauma-informed lifestyle, where we move with transformation, not against it. There is post-traumatic stress, but my friend, there is also post-traumatic growth. And we all have that opportunity and potential to grow inside. I believe healing is our natural gift, and we're all natural healers, and we can tap into that. So Yeah, our next episode is about honoring the wound, and we're going to go deeper on a kind of a more existential, spiritual level on how we can take the wound and turn it into the gift. And we want to thank you for your time and attention. I know it's been a little while, and as Sally mentioned, it's it can be very triggering and to our nervous system. So we are breathing with you, and we hope that you know that you are not alone on your healing journey. We bring this wisdom to you from our own lived experience. We hope you found something helpful in what you heard today, and we wish you well. We'll see you next time on the Radical Emergence podcast. Be well.
So thanks for joining us. And we hope you can take away some helpful tools, perhaps some great stories, and some wisdom for your own ongoing journey.
Join us for our next episode, where we will deep dive again into a universe of transformation.